Hey everybody, welcome back to Photorec.tv. I'm Toby, and today Sony announced a pretty exciting camera. It's the Alpha 1, a new flagship, 50 megapixels, 30 frames per second, 8K shooting beast. Yeah, it costs $6,500, but I'll tell you why that's a very competitive price. I've got all the details, some of the disappointments, and why I'm considering it, even though for years as a Canon shooter, I never considered a 1DX. Let's get started. This video is not going to be a deep dive into every little speck and bit of information about this camera, but I want to definitely hit some of the highlights, talk about why it's exciting on a couple of different fronts. As I said, talk about a couple of different disappointments because some of the headline leading information is a little misleading. So we want to make sure we clear that up and talk about why I'm considering it when I've never considered buying a flagship level camera before. But we should also have a real talk right up front. This is an exciting camera. It's got a flashy intro, and just like with most exciting new gear, we are compelled to want it. But we really should check in with ourselves. Is it really going to make us a better photographer? The technology in this camera, I think, really is going to shine for a select group of people. And others, you'd probably be better off taking a really nice trip once it's safe to travel again. All right, but let's look at this slide right here. 50 megapixels, 30 frames per second, silently, completely silently. This is something the A9 first did at 20 frames per second. It was impressive. Now we bumped it up to 30 frames per second, but with 50 megapixels. That's a massive amount of data. Some of the other headline grabbing features is the 8K at 30 frames per second. Yep, 8K. Sony's got that now too. Suck it, Canon. I bet that's what the Sony marketing people were saying. 4K at 120 frames per second. And this EVF right here, not this one because this is a Sony A7R III, 240 frames per second refresh rate. It's also 9.4 million dots for the resolution. Beautiful viewfinder. But this slide first clues us into what for some of you might be the first disappointment. It is not a fully articulating screen on the back. It is still, as the Sony A7R III has, just an angled screen. I think different people have different opinions about that. If we polled, I think most people would want a fully articulating screen. It just makes the camera a little bit more versatile. There are some people that like the tilty screen and not having to flip it out to the side. But let's talk a little bit about this sensor. It's a 50 megapixel backside illuminated. That's that BSI. Sony's been using these for years, and it translates to incredible low light performance. It's fantastic. They're some of the best. The stack sensor means extremely fast readout time. Now this is what allows up to 30 frames per second without worrying about distortion. When you are using silent shutter, you are using the electronic shutter. It actually turns the sensor on or off to capture the image, as opposed to actually physically moving the shutter mechanism open and closed. On older sensors, sorry, I keep wanting to say shutters. On older sensors, the readout from the sensor was slow enough that a subject moving across would actually get distorted, because as they're here, it would be red here, and then as they move, it would be red here. This is an issue. The Sony A9 took care of that. I feel like the Canon R5 and R6 also show very little distortion from rolling shutter or this kind of readout of the shutter. But 50 megapixels, and it's going to be able to do this. And I trust Sony. As far as, there are statements in here that make this camera seem a little bit better than it is, but as far as their statement here, I do trust them that it is capable of fast enough readout to capture just about all of the fastest action you could want silently without any distortion. Standard ISO range, I believe, because this is a backside illuminated sensor, that this is going to continue to do really well. Up to 15 stops of dynamic range. Actually, I think technically they say 15 plus stops. And I want to just highlight this real quick. Improved auto white balance support using the sensors on the front of the camera. So typically, the image is coming in, hitting the sensor, and the camera's making adjustments and decisions about what that white balance should be based on that data. It's now going to include data coming in through the sensors on the front of the camera to further improve the white balance. And it is an image stabilized sensor as well. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this slide, just highlight the fact that it's going to have the pixel shift shooting method, the newest and most improvedest method of it. It's going to allow you to shoot up to 199 megapixels. Now this Sony a7R III will shoot 4 images, smush them together for the same resolution but with finer detail in it. The Sony a7R IV improved that and said, okay, we're going to do 4 of those 4 sandwiches, and then we are going to stitch them together. And it does this all through shifting the sensor. And now the A1, the Alpha 1, is going to do this, but up to 5 times faster. Now, when I reviewed the Sony a7R IV, I kind of poo-pooed this pixel shift. I rarely use it on my Sony. I didn't see myself using it a whole lot on the a7R IV, but since I made that video, I haven't used it much more, but I used it once here in Seattle and ended up printing an epic print from Bayphoto. This is one of their 600 DPI prints. I made a pixel shift panorama of the downtown Seattle skyline, and it now hangs above my dining room table. It's a 60 by 30 inch print, and I love staring at it. The detail is ridiculous. You can put your nose up to the image and it is fantastic. Now, if there's any motion, this pixel shift multi-shooting method doesn't work great, like trees blowing in the wind, waves, of course subjects like people walking through. They get funky because over the course of this pixel shift, as they shift, they kind of leave behind these red and green ghosts of themselves. There was some wind in the trees for my shot, and I'm going to do a whole different video about it, so I'm going to kind of wrap up this little segment very quickly. And I'll just say, with a little bit of work, I was able to take care of that, and it is just fantastic. So being able to shoot a 200 megapixel, basically a 17,000 by 11,000 image is kind of exciting. Updated Bion's processor, 8 times faster. This is where we're going to see the improved autofocus system that's in this camera. Sony is saying that it is the best ever. Improved human, eye detect, face detect, all kinds of improved pattern recognition that basically translate into it being able to track your subject better. And of course, we have a lot of video data coming into this camera if you're shooting 8K. But now let's talk a little bit about that headline that's grabbing a lot of attention. 50 megapixels at 30 frames per second. Well, you're only going to get that if you shoot compressed RAW. And that is, as you see, this chart is copied directly from stuff Sony passed me earlier today. As a Sony shooter for many years, we've had uncompressed RAW and compressed RAW as an option. I have shot compressed RAW primarily 99% of the time, maybe 98% of the time. I struggle to really see a difference between compressed RAW and uncompressed RAW. Notice here under image quality, they say best, good, but again, I really struggle to see a difference. There are some times where I set up in a scene and I think this is one of the most epic, ultimate, gorgeous landscapes I've ever seen. I'll make sure I'm shooting uncompressed RAW. Now in the Sony Alpha 1, we have lossless compressed RAW. So it is going to absolutely look identical to the uncompressed RAW, but it's 50 to 80% of the file size. You are still limited to just 20 frames per second with that shooting, that silent shooting, which we need to get to that in a minute as well. So if you look, the number of images you can record continuously, uncompressed RAW, 82. Lossless compressed RAW, 96. And if you're shooting the compressed RAW on high plus at 30 frames per second, you can get up to 155. So if you're shooting 30 frames per second, 155 divided by 30 is what, 5? That should be about 5. 15, 3 times 5, yeah. If you're shooting down at 20 frames per second, you can shoot up to 238. This is basically before the buffer fills up, if that wasn't clear. And I believe this is on the highest speed SDXC cards. So that's one issue. I think on here, the only things I really want to hit is the fact that that 30 frames per second or the 20 frames per second is electronic shutter. So absolutely no wear and tear on your shutter mechanism at all. And this is great. You're not going to make any noise to spook subjects, maybe shy ducks if you're a wildlife photographer, or dance recitals, or golf. You don't have to have one of those crazy sound baffles on your camera anymore. You can still shoot 30 frames per second. This is blackout free too. That means when you're looking through the viewfinder and you're tracking your subject, when the shutter is firing, you still see your subject, which makes for really easy or better tracking capabilities. I have what about Heif files in here because this is another format that's offered. Canon has started to offer this as well. Think of it like an improved JPEG. It's got a higher bit depth. It is better files, improved files, but really about the same size as JPEG, so that's great. I'm curious, I haven't seen data yet on what kind of continuous shooting you can get with those. I absolutely know that it's 30 frames per second, but how many before your buffer fills up? And this is another world's first here that we want to mention is typically LED lights have a flicker to them. Same as fluorescent lights, but LEDs it's a faster flicker. And silent shutters have had issues with that. This camera, the Alpha 1, will now have a system to help you avoid that. And last important note, we're talking about all these fast frame rates. That's all with the electronic shutter. So there are times where that might not work for you, like in a situation where there's a lot of flickering lights, or you need a flash because the flash does not work with that electronic shutter. So you're limited to just 10 frames per second mechanical shutter, which is slower than our flagships from Canon and Nikon. Important things to keep in mind. Video. I'm not a video guy. I'm really excited to see what Jordan Drake says about this camera. I think if you are a very serious videographer and you're in the Sony world, I think their cinema line, their FS line, or the A7S III is going to be a better camera for you. But that's not to say that this is an amazing video beast. 8K 30p, that is 420, so that's what's a little bit exciting, less exciting. As you drop the numbers off the end, it's not as good, is a simple way to think about that, and it's 10-bit. 4K, 120p, and 60p is 422, so see that number at the end is higher than 0, so it's a little bit better. Improved rolling shutter because of the faster readout speed. It's got a better image stabilization system for handheld when you're shooting at 4K 60 and slower. And it is able to output 4K 60 at 16-bit RAW to an external recorder. And of course, we're not going to talk about it in this video other than to mention it right now. Sony announced the Xperia 1 Pro 1 Mark II that can double as a visual kind of aid. It doesn't record though. So even though in this example I threw that on there, it is not an external recorder. It's only an external monitor. But with an external recorder like a Ninja Atomos, you're going to be able to record 4K 60p 16-bit RAW. That autofocus system that I talked about being improved because of that kind of updated Bions processor system, it's making 120 calculations per second. With 759 points, that gives it a 92% coverage. So you have a very smart brain in here. Capable of focusing down to -4 EV and still capable of autofocusing up to f/22, which is nice. When you think about putting on longer telephoto lenses and some teleconverters, I don't see when you'd get up to f/22, but your autofocus system is going to still work. And improved eye tracking in both animals and humans, and as I said, improvements that give better pattern recognition. It basically boils down to more capable at tracking your subjects with new bird eye AF. Now, with the Sony a7R IV and sometimes with the a7R III, I see it try to lock onto bird's eye or where it thinks a bird eye should be. It's not super reliable. With the Alpha 1 now, they are saying that this is a feature and function that you're going to be able to rely on. It is not only going to be able to track the bird as it's hopping around in the branches, but it's also going to track the bird as it's flying. And that improved animals and humans, it's not always just finding the eye. I have a one-eyed dog, and I talked about this when they first released the updates that allowed the animal eye AF on the Sony a7R III. It locks onto where his eye should be. It's doing face and pattern recognition and head shape recognition. Now it's going to be able to even do it if your dog's upside down. Like last night, my dog had the zoomies and spent about a half an hour scooting around on the couch upside down. It should find that eye in that case as well. And you, of course, you can manually select left or right eye. You have controls for that. Let's talk a minute about the mechanical shutter because there's some cool features here. Carbon fiber. I don't know of any other shutter systems using that right now. And it's dual drive, meaning spring loaded, which has been shutters for millions of years. You know what I mean. But it also has electromagnetic drive as well. Rated up to 500,000 actuations. But again, I think many of you who are choosing to use this camera are going to be shooting often in electronic shutter mode, silent shutter mode, and so that doesn't have any wear and tear on your shutter system. Fastest flash sync speed when you're using that mechanical shutter is 1/400th of a second, which is significantly higher than many other cameras on the market. But keep that in mind, you have to be shooting mechanical to hit that. Let's take a moment and say, yes, fast Wi-Fi in this camera. This is where you really see this camera targeted at kind of professional sports and news who not only need to capture the images, but then get them quickly back to their editors. I think we're going to see a lot of neat stuff out of this camera from the Olympics. It's got an Ethernet port. The A9s have that as well. That's a Giga Ethernet port, but it also has 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi, which is impressive. Also over here, we've got a flash sync. We've got the standard little multi-USB port. We've got USB-C 3.2 generation, which means incredibly fast transfer speeds. That also is what allows you to connect to the Xperia 2 Pro 2 to use it as a visual aid. And it also allows you to charge fast charging and power the camera while using to not drained batteries. Full-size HDMI port, yes. And of course, mic and headphone jacks there. It's going to support UHS 1, although that's certainly going to lock you out of some of the faster features and higher bit rates of video. UHS 2, the SDXC cards, and new CF Express Type A. I don't know at this time you know, how fast a card you need to be able to hit what video formats and or 30 frames per second, how that's going to affect your buffer. It certainly is to some degree. But what they state is that you don't need the CF Express cards for shooting 8K video. That is workable with SDXC. And I mentioned right up at the top, why am I considering this camera when I've never considered a flagship from Canon, despite years as a Canon shooter? And the answer is right there on, I think it's right over my shoulder, the size and the weight of this camera. For me, as kind of a general purpose travel photographer, sometimes wildlife photographer, it just didn't make sense to carry around such a large flagship camera as you have with the 1DX. And their megapixel counts for landscape are a little less exciting, sitting around 20 megapixels. So being able to basically have this same size camera, but have a flagship level wildlife and sports focusing system and frame rate with 50 megapixels for great landscapes and Sony's class-leading dynamic range and low light performance, that suddenly becomes a lot more attractive. Now, look over here real quick, 1 pound, 10 ounces. I think Sony's actually made a mistake here because in another slide they say 737 grams, which equals about 1.6 pounds. So I think it's going to be closer to 1.6 pounds. Let's throw this chart up for just a moment because as I just said, Nikon D6, Canon 1DX, I mean, a lot of you are bulking at this price. Somebody wrote me today and said, for that price, it should wipe your butt. Okay. Yeah, I mean, that would be great, but look at these other cameras and then let's go down through the specs. I mean, 50 megapixels in the Sony versus 21 from the Nikon and the Canon. In-body image stabilization, the sensor is stabilized, whereas Nikon and Canon's is not. The number of focus points. You do have bigger touch screens and better resolution screens. So not only is it a little disappointing that the back screen on the Sony is just flip up for many of you, but the fact that it's a little bit of a lower resolution screen is kind of a bummer. You're going to spend a lot of time looking through that viewfinder to enjoy that really high resolution screen. Max shutter speed of 1/32,000th of a second. That higher flash speed, the max frame rate, of course, at 30 with the Sony, with those catches that I explained earlier. 8K at 30 versus the other two only offer 4K. Now the last one, battery life, looks like Sony is a clear loser, but SIPA needs to adjust how they do these tests with mirrorless cameras. My experience with the Sony A9, which is rated at about 600 SIPA, I regularly get far above 2,000 shots on a single battery. So I do give the win still to Canon and Nikon in the realm of battery life, but the fact that this battery is this size, which is like, what, about a third of the size, because it is still using these Sony batteries, about a third of the size of the Canon and Nikon, and you're going to get realistically about 2,000 shots. I don't know on the video side of things. And there are those weights again. Nikon D6 at 2.8 pounds. The Canon is well over 3 pounds, and this is half that weight. I do want to recognize, though, some of you really don't like the ergonomics of Sony, especially with longer lenses. And I'll be real with you, I don't love it, but I love being able to carry around such a small, slim, lightweight camera that I'll make that sacrifice. If I had to pick the best ergonomics of any camera right now, I think the R5 and R6 are just awesome. But they're a bit bigger and bulkier, and they also don't have the lens selection that I want right now. I'm not switching. All right, so that's basically all I wanted to say about this. I'm really curious. I glossed over some specs. I think the big disappointments are, yes, you can hit 30 frames per second, but you are going to be shooting compressed RAW. It is only a little flippy screen, and of course it does cost $6,500, but as we looked at that chart, I believe that is competitive, and I think Sony will do well. A9 users, how are you feeling? I think we're going to see that price come down a good bit more on the A9. And for all of us folks that, you know, are struggling to say $6,500 for a camera, well, hang on. Hopefully soon we're going to have that A7 IV, which I think is going to be a very nice camera. Certainly going to have some of these features and specs, some. And the big question too, I think for a lot of Sony shooters is, will any of these cool features be released in firmware updates, like the improved bird or improved anno? I suspect not, because I think it's relying a lot on those updated processors and that 8 times processing speed. So we might see some firmware updates and improvements in our older Sony cameras, but I wouldn't hold your breath. If you appreciated this look in this video, give it a quick thumbs up. That's a nice way to thank me for my time. If you really appreciated it, I would love if you shopped through B&H through my link, photorec.tv/A1. The Alpha 1 goes on sale tomorrow morning. If you're watching this the day I release it, January 26th, it goes on sale January 27th. And if you use my links, that is a fantastic way to thank me for my time. It really does greatly help this channel. You got questions, you got comments, you got thoughts, you can leave them right down below and I'll make sure I respond. Thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.